Hello Classic Crew, and welcome to today's video where we're going to be talking about why our modern approach to sex is actually way worse for women. If you are new to my channel, here we talk about classic living and traditional values. And I would love if you would consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell, as well as heading over to my Substack newsletter where you can join our amazing community of women and get access to a ton of exclusive content, including my book club, my podcast, and exclusive weekly articles. So for my Classically Abby book club over on my Substack, we recently read a book called Cheap Sex by Mark Regnerus, who's a sociologist. And it was really eye-opening. I highly recommend picking it up if you are interested in reading it, because it is fantastic. And I wanted to hit on some of the points that he talks about. So he talks a lot about how sex has become economically cheap in our day and age, where it's just easy access from both a physical perspective and an online perspective. You can have sex in really any form you want without working very hard for it, and what that has done to our society and especially to women. So today, I really want to talk about how our attitude towards sex as women is not better for women in the long run. It's actually much, much worse. So let's get into today's video. Let's start off by talking about how sex became cheap. So really, the first thing that made sex cheap was the advent of birth control. Before birth control existed, sex and conception were inherently linked. There were ways to get around it, sure. You could absolutely have sex and not get pregnant, but there was always a risk that you would get pregnant. And with that in mind, it meant that you had to be more responsible about who you had sex with and when you had sex. Or at least you should have been, because if you weren't, then you could get pregnant, and that could have consequences that perhaps you didn't want to happen. With the advent of birth control, physical pleasure became entirely separate from the consequence of that physical pleasure. Sex became something totally separate than having a baby, which actually was not a good thing. It meant that sex became so much more about just stimulation than it did about the connection you were having with that other person and recognizing that that person could be the father of your children. Now, when you separate sex from conception, the problem is that in people's minds, it's an unnatural result of sex to get pregnant, which is exactly the opposite of the truth, right? We know that sex and pregnancy are absolutely linked, but birth control gives you the perception that the worst outcome of sex, the most unnatural outcome of sex, is pregnancy. And when that's the case, not only do people feel like pregnancy is now a choice, that choice can lead to abortions. Because, oh, well, if this is an unnatural result of sex, then I shouldn't have to deal with it, and I don't want to deal with the consequences. Now, I'm not somebody who believes that sex is only for the purpose of having a child. Sex is about intimacy for a couple. It makes a couple come together closer and express their emotional feelings for each other in a physical way. It's a beautiful way to express our love for one another and come closer together as couples. But there's also always an understanding that it can lead to pregnancy. Even birth control is never 100% effective. And because of that, it should never be treated lightly, even though in 99% of cases, or 96% of cases for most birth controls, you won't get pregnant. The next part of the puzzle is the rise of the pure relationship over the traditional relationship. Anthony Giddens, who is another sociologist that Mark Regnerus references quite a bit in Cheap Sex, came up with this theory of the pure relationship. So Giddens' argument about the pure relationship is that nowadays we have an understanding of relationships that's pretty self-absorbed and me based. Essentially, what Anthony Giddens argues is that the pure relationship exists only to meet the partner's needs, and as soon as those needs are met, the relationship can end. Couples are together because of love or because of sexual fulfillment, but they're not together because of tradition or duty. And because relationships are really seen as a way for you to find yourself, they're very short-lived. the phrase pure relationship sounds positive. It sounds like it's pure. It's not based on anything else. But marriages and relationships are based on commitments. They're based on traditions and duties to one another and to your children. And it's not just about what am I getting today? Am I happy today? Do I feel fulfilled today by you? Sometimes relationships are about putting in hard work and recognizing that you need to fight for what you built together and for the family that you have. And traditional relationships do that. Traditional relationships recognize that there's a lot more to a relationship than just, I loved you yesterday, but I don't love you today, so now it's over. As relationships became more pure and less traditional, we see a decline in marriage. We see a rise in divorce, and we see sex treated as another path to fulfillment as opposed to something that is engaged in for the intimacy of a couple within a traditional relationship. So with those two things in mind, that leads us to number 3. Getting married has become less and less easy to do. Men can have access to sex with absolutely no problem. Men don't have to wait to have sex with someone because women don't feel like the sex that they are having needs to be with someone who will support them, raise children with them, or marry them. So sex is economically cheap. Men are able to have sex incredibly easily or access pornography on the internet, and they don't need to wait to have sex, and in doing so, better themselves, have a good career in place so they can support a family. Men are really let off the hook, and women are the ones who are paying the price. Women want to be married. This isn't a question of whether or not women want to be married. Women want to be married. And when we have economically cheapened sex so that it's just available at any time to anyone, it makes it so that it is a lot harder to get married, because now it's not just, oh, men are going to get married to have sex and have a family. Men now have to come to a conclusion that the relationship they are in is pure enough for it to lead to marriage. Now, the really sad thing is number 4. The women who want to wait till marriage are now in a competition with the women who don't. And when I say women who don't want to wait until marriage, I really think we're talking about an empowerment lie that women have bought into from a feminist narrative that says that they will enjoy their lives more if they have sex outside of marriage. But the fact of the matter is, women do not find sexual satisfaction having sex outside of marriage, even though that's what they're told that they will do, and they will have a better sex life outside of marriage. Women don't enjoy sex in the same way when they're not married because it's unstable and they don't know that it's going to last. And even though it can be sexually fun, pleasurable for a short time, it's not sexually satisfactory in the long run. So what ends up happening is you have women who want to wait being put in a position of having to consider their options. Can they wait? Will they be able to find a guy who's willing to wait for them? Because now that sex is so cheap, he can go anywhere. He doesn't have to wait for you. And now all of these people who complain that there's too much emphasis put on beauty in our society and that everyone needs to look perfect. Well, it makes sense. This is why, number 5, because sex is now mostly about physical pleasure. It's not about emotional intimacy between a couple. It's cheap, it's easy to access. And when sex is about physical pleasure and not about emotional intimacy, then of course it's going to be based off looks more than anything else. When sex is first and foremost about physical pleasure for men and women, more than a long-lasting relationship that lasts for both sides, then sexual attractiveness becomes the most important thing, not the relationship that spurs a beautiful sex life. And I want to touch on this point, which is number 6. Because marriage is now so much harder to attain, because marriage is not treated as something that people need, it's treated as something that people can do if they want. It's not considered the building block of a family or the building block of a relationship. Women are getting married older. It's harder and harder to meet somebody, and it's harder and harder to get married. So as women are waiting longer and longer to get married, they're also waiting longer and longer to have children. And fertility now becomes an issue because women are getting married older and older. Instead of thinking about fertility, women are looking for confluent love, pure relationships, this fulfillment that they think will come out of marriage, but is really based on their self-absorbed finding themselves mentality. And the men that they want to marry are able to avoid making this commitment until much later down the line as well. And then all of a sudden, they're 35 and having to use IVF to get pregnant because getting pregnant as you get older is more difficult. All of this is a testament to the fact that marriage has become something an elite few people do because they want to, instead of a necessary part of starting a family. And as you guys know, I think marriage is incredibly important, and I think it's one of the most beautiful things that people can do. But without that building block, we are seeing women suffer in so many ways. Less physical satisfaction, having sex with men that they probably wouldn't want to have sex with but feel pressured to because if they want to enter into a real relationship, a lot of men are not willing to do so unless they have sex. Waiting longer and longer to get married and allowing sex to be economically cheap, and then struggling with fertility down the line. So the empowerment narrative that, oh, we should all be having as much sex as possible before we're married outside of marriage, and that's really empowering. Who is it empowering? At the end of the day, it gives over much more power to men. Men are the ones who get to now have access to something that they didn't have access to before unless they made the commitment, unless they promised to support you and stay with you. And you know who's losing? Women. So I really wanted to talk today about this. I hope it gave you something to think about. Make sure to check out Cheap Sex by Mark Regnerus. If you liked what you saw today, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. And if you're not already subscribed to my Substack newsletter, go ahead and head over to classicallyabby.substack.com. If you'd like to follow me on social media, it's at classicallyabby, absolutely everywhere. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!